Today I'm talking about Canadian smocking. So the first thing when we talk about smocking is disambiguation. If you've heard of smocking before, it's probably English smocking, and that would be pleated fabric with embroidery on top. But Canadian smocking, or North American smocking, is a texture created by stitching points together on the opposite side of the fabric. And there are a bunch of traditional patterns. This dates back into, I want to say, the 1700s, if not earlier. And it's been used for decoration. There's also some uses potentially for elastic before there was elastic. And so I'm going to go through today, like, how does this even work? And then I'm going to do a short demonstration of how do you do it. So some context here, I'm coming in from an origami tessellation standpoint. And so this is very much the same idea of we're creating a repeating geometric pattern from a single sheet of material, but we're doing it with fabric. And so we're doing it without folding. So what happens when you smock is you take a piece of fabric, and I've got this random piece of flannel, and for demonstration purposes I didn't bother to iron it, but you would want to iron it if you want to make some finished project out of it. And then you pick the pattern that you want to make with it. So this could be the puffy triangles pattern that I mentioned earlier, or that I was showing earlier. It could be a variation on that pattern. It could be a different pattern entirely. This is one that's pretty complex to fold with origami, but actually pretty simple with smocking. There's patterns that are the same in 6 directions instead of 3. There's patterns based on a square grid. I tend to focus on the patterns on triangle grids because those are my favorite, and they're also like not explored at all in the traditional smocking like patterns. But there's so many options with square grids too. And one of the things I'm going to be talking about in a video coming soon is how to translate between an origami pattern. So this is paper, it's folded flat. And you can take that and make a smocking pattern for one side, or you can make a smocking pattern for the other side. And that's the thing about smocking. It is one-sided, where origami tessellations, you can see either side as front. With smocking, you have to pick a side, and you have to choose in advance. So let's say we want to work on that puffy triangles pattern like I was showing earlier, and you want to get a pattern for that. You can go to gatheringfolds.com, or without the dot cut out, gatheringfolds.com, and I have physical templates. You can see I've got a fine and a coarse size of this template. I also have digital templates so you can print out the exact size that you want. For today's purposes, I'm going to go with the coarse pattern just because that'll get us a quicker demo. And I'm going to place it like this onto my fabric. I'm going to grab my fabric marking pen. If it's a demo, a Sharpie would also work. And I'm going to go ahead and mark the connected points. So this point, the next connected points are off the sheet, so I'm going to ignore that. I'm just going to go for the ones that are connected, and I'm going to draw the connections between them. You can see on the template, I have the cutouts for drawing the lines. You can see very clearly what points are connected. And if I had a bigger sheet of fabric that I wanted to do this on, I would be picking up the template once I've drawn all the connections that I can get. And in that context, I would be drawing all of the points that I can locate on here. And then I'd be picking up the template and moving it. Let's say I'm moving this way so that the points line up, and then I can draw further out. So we've got our pattern onto the fabric, and now I'm going to get out needle and thread, and I also like to use beeswax and a thimble because often when I'm doing this, it's larger pieces like the red one I was showing earlier, and so you end up doing a lot of this, and you can hurt your fingers if the fabric is particularly thick. Like I did a faux suede pillow, and after 8 hours, I learned, yes, you do need to use a thimble. So yes, this is time consuming, but you can make these swatches into pretty much anything you want. So if you look behind me there, there's these 2 Christmas stockings, and those are basically taking a smocked panel like this, laying down the backing and the lining, and just sewing around the outline of the shape that you want, and then flipping inside out to get the finished piece. And actually, if you're curious about the smocked stocking, I do have specific videos on how to make that, how to set up the fabric, how to source your fabric. I use a stretch satin for those. And that can all be found at training.gatheringfolds.com/stocking. And I'll make sure that that link is down below as well. But yeah, gatheringfolds.com for patterns. I currently have 4 available in 2 sizes each in physical form, and a couple more in digital form, if I remember correctly. And then I have so many patterns that I have not put up yet. So if there's interest, I'll put up more. And then when we go, so I doubled my thread. I put it onto my needle by threading the folded end of the thread through the needle and then putting the needle back through the loop. So now I have a removable needle on a double thread. And what I'm going to do is grab a few threads of the fabric at my target point. So I'm going in here and basically holding, well, if I can pick up my needle, I'm holding my fabric and I've got my finger under there. So I don't want to stab too deep. I'm just grabbing a few threads on the needle and pulling through because I have a knot tied at the end. And then I'm going to grab a few threads from the next connected point. And this is going to pull those 2 points together. And then I have a third connected point as well. So I'm going to grab a few threads there and pull that in. So I now am coming back and tying a knot. It doesn't have to be a super strong knot. I'm just doing a normal knot that you would tie in anything really. You could choose to tie more special knots. It's fine either way. And now I need to plan a route around my fabric. And this is super arbitrary. All we're going for is that all of these groups of points end up tied together. So I could go counterclockwise, I could go clockwise. If I have a bigger group like a bigger amount of this pattern, then what I typically end up doing is zigzagging. So you can kind of see, that's the ending end. This was my starting side. And I'm just zigzagging along and then zigzagging back, and then zigzagging along and zigzagging back for this particular pattern. Some patterns, like a lot of the patterns, work well in stripes like that. And if I was to do that on this particular example, I'm not going to cut the thread. I'm just going to go to that next starting point. And now when I land there, instead of pulling straight through, I'm going to grab my thread, bring it over to the needle, and notice that I'm not pulling. I'm not creating tension between that last set of points and this one. I'm going to loop once, loop twice, hold on top there so I don't end up pulling this tighter, and pull through. So now I have a secure knot at that point. And then I'm going to go and grab my next points. And now I'm going to pass the needle under the thread, bring it up against the knot in there. Zoom in for you. And I'm going to loop twice. And looping once, looping twice, it's kind of arbitrary. And again, I'm going to hold as I pull through, and now I have a secure knot for those 3 points. So moving on to the next set of points, you'll notice I have this fold that is leading me to the next point. And one of the things to pay attention to, like especially when you're marking your pattern, is what marker or pen you're going to use. And what does that mean for when you're stitching? Because you want it to have enough contrast with the fabric that you can see it, even when there's folds, even when there's shadows. Now I'm going to go to the next set of points. But you don't want it to have so much contrast that it bleeds through to the other side and is visible there. Likewise, you want it to be permanent enough that you see it when you're working. So chalk might not be a good idea, but not permanent enough that you see it on the other side of the fabric. And so oftentimes it's harder because of that to work with very light colored, very thin fabrics. So if I'm working with a white fabric, that is something I'm going to have a really hard time marking because the lines between the points are always, pretty much always, going to be visible if they bleed through to the other side. The points themselves probably won't be because they're being tied together and staying in that back layer. But the lines between the points are going to show. So one more set of stitches here. And there we have it. Tying off. And I'm just gonna snip that. And I'm gonna tidy up a little bit. So I'm going to move some points around, move some folds to act like I have more of the pattern done than I actually do. And that is all I'm going to do on that front. And then we flip the paper, or you can tell my tendency. We flip the fabric over and we have these puffy triangles. So when you're doing smocking, you're going to need a decent amount of pattern before things lay down nicely. This is kind of the bare minimum, where even here I should tuck that point a little bit to get that nice separation. But it's enough to see that the pattern is going to work well. It's enough to practice like what order you're going in. So that's what's going on with Canadian smocking. I hope you enjoy trying out some of these patterns for yourself. And one thing I will mention is a lot of the traditional patterns based on a square grid are really easy to draw on something like a gingham, where you already have a grid on the fabric, and so you're able to mark your points very easily. So happy smocking, everyone. I hope you have an excellent day.